I'll be your MC for the afternoon. So it's with a great honor, again, to introduce to you to Aymeric. He will be taking us through the pulse of ESG FinTech, 2023 takeaways and key trends for 2024. Aymeric, over to you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for having me here today. My name is Aymeric Salley. I'm a director at KPMG Singapore in FinTech and Innovation. I'm here today to share insights into a public report that we've conducted for the Monetary Authority of Singapore into ESG FinTech. The report was published earlier today, and there will be a QR code at the end of this presentation for you to be able to download it. So as part of this research, we've studied 2022 and 2023 deal activity globally in ESG FinTech. And we've interviewed over 15 category leaders from the financial and tech sectors to understand the level of activity inside their organization, building product and solutions with ESG at the core of the business model. So at the time where sustainability transition has become ever more critical, and against the backdrop of macroeconomic headwinds, our intention, together with the Monetary Authority of Singapore, was to understand the level of activity in ESG FinTech globally, regionally, and locally, understand segment trends, monitor, identify whether ESG FinTech hubs are emerging around the world, and identify whether any of these cities are doing anything differently. So before we dive into these insights, let's start with reminding ESG FinTech taxonomy, which was jointly published between KPMG and MAS last year in the inaugural report. So we call it the 6+2 because we believe there are 6 product verticals and 2 enabling segments that are making up ESG FinTech. The 6 product verticals are ESG RegTech, InsurTech, carbon services, investment management, lending, payment and transactions, supported by ESG data and ESG infrastructure. So we've looked at investment in 2 ways. The first way is external investment. So that would be your M&A activity, that would be your PE VC funding into pure play ESG FinTech startup. And that is represented in purple on the chart. But we've also looked at in-house spend, which is the budget allocated by financial and tech sector, building product and solution with ESG at the core of the business model. And this is what we found. So firstly, with $16.5 billion flowing into ESG FinTech startup last year, ESG FinTech represented 10% of the total FinTech sector, which captured $164 billion. So ESG FinTech, 10% of FinTech. Second, with $28.8 billion this year, slightly down from $29.4 billion last year total investments, we see that ESG FinTech is showing remarkable resilience in a very difficult environment. When we look at the distribution of this spend in 2023, we see that external investment is significantly down from $16.5 billion last year to $11.5 billion this year. But we also see that in-house spend is surging from $12.8 billion last year to $17.3 billion this year. And so we believe this will continue to accelerate. We believe external investment is going to rebound next year to levels similar to 2022. And in-house spend, as reported by the company that we've surveyed, is going to continue to increase steadily over the next few years. We've also looked at regional disparities. So we couldn't identify regional patterns from what was reported by the company we surveyed. So we looked at a proxy, which is external investment. And what we saw is that ESG FinTech deal activity continued to grow in the Americas this year, and it's the only region where it is growing, notably because deals in the Americas this year are larger on average than last year. How can we explain that? When we look at the top deals in America this year, we see increased institutional participation. Investors at some of the top deals include Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, Manulife. When we look at Europe, we see sustained deal flow. We're expecting about close to 200 deals this year, similar level with last year, but the deals are much smaller than in the past. That shows a very strong, dynamic early-stage funding landscape, and funding is drying up at later stages in Europe at the moment. And when we look at Middle East and Africa and APAC, we see a similar trend, whereby in 2022 was characterized with very large deals and mega deals in both Middle East and Africa and APAC. Notably, there were 3 deals above $1 billion in APAC last year. And these large and mega deals have not materialized so far in these two regions. We've looked at segment trends, and this is what we find. In 2022, the two largest segments of ESG FinTech attracting the most funding were RegTech and carbon services, each attracting over $3 billion in funding. This year, they are trending very differently. RegTech is down to 1.6 billion, and carbon services, which is the only growing segment at the moment, almost doubled in size to 5.9 billion. We see also some interesting regional dynamics. APAC is particularly strong at ESG lending with a dual focus, environmental sustainability and social inclusivity through microfinance and credit scoring. Americas and Europe are particularly strong at carbon services and RegTech. We see that the ecosystem in these two geographies is particularly skewed toward these two segments. And lastly, ESG InsurTech, ESG payment transactions, which had strong funding in the past few years, saw a real drought in funding this year in 2023. We saw very, very few deals in these two segments. We've looked at deal activity across cities as well to try and understand whether ESG FinTech hubs are emerging around the world. And so this is what we found. In the Americas, unsurprisingly, San Francisco and New York dominate with a different focus. San Francisco is particularly strong at carbon services and ESG infrastructure, while New York focuses more on RegTech and investment management. In Europe, the two ESG FinTech hubs are London and Paris. London particularly saw a very dynamic funding landscape. So the period considered here is 18 months, 2022 and the first half of 2023. And London saw 68 deals in ESG FinTech, which is the highest number globally. We also saw in Europe a lot of activity in Germany, but it was scattered all across the country, so we couldn't pinpoint one city which could be an ESG FinTech hub. Lastly, in APAC, we see a very dynamic landscape in Australia, well distributed across Melbourne and Sydney. In Shenzhen, there were a few large deals. And in Singapore, there is a large number of small deals. So Singapore is a very dynamic ESG FinTech sector, but in the early stages with seed to Series A type of companies. This being the Singapore FinTech Festival, we wanted to end on a snapshot of the Singapore ESG FinTech landscape. So Singapore is emerging as an ESG FinTech hub and had launched a number of initiatives. So there's the Singapore Green Plan 2030, which include 5 pillars: city in nature, sustainable living, energy reset, green economy, and resilient future. Singapore has a FinTech regulatory sandbox to experiment with innovative financial solutions. It started industry partnership, and I'm sure you're going to hear a lot about those over the next few days, notably Greenprint. Please do visit the booth over there. So Project Greenprint, Nova, the Green Finance Industry Task Force, and the Singapore FinTech Association this year launched a Green and Sustainable FinTech Subcommittee. $150 million were allocated in grant as part of FTSI 3.0 this year for FinTech, including ESG FinTech. There's a tech skill accelerator program to upskill local workforce. And as part of this report, we've included a company directory that we aim as comprehensive as possible, listing all the ESG FinTech companies in Singapore. And those includes the pure play ESG FinTech startups, as well as the FinTech startups that are expanding into ESG. And we found 105 companies in there, of which 77% are local, headquartered in Singapore. And top 3 segments are data, carbon services, and RegTech. So I'd like to thank you everyone for attending today. We have a big mission ahead of us to bring more of the financial and tech sector and accelerate the momentum. On behalf of KPMG, I'd like to warmly thank the Monetary Authority of Singapore for the collaboration on this research. And we're looking forward to continue tracking and monitoring the space as we go. Please do download the publication by scanning the QR code. Please do reach out to us for more collaboration in this space. And please, please enjoy the next few days. Thank you very much.
All right, I'm going to give you a few seconds to download the reports. Please scan the QR code. I am super impressed by how many people are around in the ESG stage. I mean, we've got overflowing even outside of the space. Amazing. All right. Right, let's get started. So with a show of hands, we're between friends now. Who's fundraising here at the moment? Oh, not just one person, 2, 3. All right, liars. Okay, so the next panel, Aymeric, is generously going to help us to moderate this one. And it's what are investors on the lookout for? So I think it's going to be an interesting one. There's diverging views and experiences. So Aymeric, à toi.
Hello back. So it's my great pleasure to be hosting and moderating this panel of ESG, FinTech, and investors. So please help me welcome Ben, Raymond, Kairu, and Mari on stage.
One more time.
So thank you, everyone, for being here. As we just saw, ESG FinTech is resilient in this environment, but they're facing some challenges, notably external investment. We have assembled a great panel of ESG FinTech and ESG FinTech investor today. Maybe I can start by asking them to introduce themselves and their organization, starting with Raymond, maybe.
Thanks, Aymeric. So Ramon Gazelle, I'm the co-founder of ESG Tech. We're a Singapore-based first-party ESG data management and disclosure platform that's enabling the efficient allocation of capital, particularly with a sustainable or ESG lens to it.
Hi, lovely to be here. My name's Marie. I'm one of the founding partners of Wavemaker Impact. We are Southeast Asia's first climate tech venture builder. So we find experienced entrepreneurs and build companies that have the potential to abate 100 megatons of carbon dioxide emissions and be $100 million revenue businesses on an annual basis. So very lovely to be here.
Hello everyone, my name is Hairu. We are from Investable. Investable is an early stage VC, and so by early we invest in anything before Series A. So seed, pre-series, that's kind of our lane. We have made close to about 100 over investments globally with a larger concentration in Australia and Southeast Asia, which is kind of why we have offices in both Sydney as well as in Singapore. We are managing 4 funds at this point in time. The last 2 funds are 100% focused into climate. Insofar, we have made about 20-odd investments in climate across APAC. And with our 4th fund that we are launching with Mandiri, which is the largest bank in Indonesia, we're going deeper into Southeast Asia and trying to build this corridor across Australia and Southeast Asia. Looking forward to learn from my esteemed panels and catching up with many of you guys. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Ben, founder and CEO of Kogo. Kogo is a carbon management platform. We reach 35 million individuals, so one question. Who knows their carbon footprint in the audience? That's a pretty good start, right? So if we can't measure our carbon, how are we going to do anything about climate change? So we work with banks, empowering their customers to see in the banking app their carbon footprint and encourage them to reduce it. But yeah, great to be here. Nice to see a big stage talking about this issue.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. So I'd like to dive right in because we've seen that external investment in ESG fintech is down. It's also down for the broader fintech ecosystem. We have two venture capitalists on the panel with us today. So I want to ask a very simple question. What's happening first with startup funding this year? Do you see any difference between ESG fintech and fintech? And if yes, what are those? And what's your outlook for next year? Please come with good news.
Okay, so first of all, the outlook overall, I mean, it is funding winter. So, VC funds are being more selective with their investments. Startups are raising now in a more challenging environment. We're definitely seeing a flight to value. So a much stronger focus on unit economics rather than on sexy growth metrics, which I personally think overall is good for the VC space. So I guess that's the overall picture. Specifically, I don't think the fintech category has been worse affected or less affected compared to other categories of investment. What I will say is that we have seen climate being very, very resilient. We have 6 companies in our portfolio at the moment. One of them raised a pre-series A round and is gearing up for its A round next year. Another one of our companies, kind of 3 months into launch, received an inbound convertible note from Norchicken Bank, which is the largest agricultural bank in Japan. So we're seeing a strong demand for climate and climate tech companies. So I think that's wonderful for the industry. And of course, in my view, climate change is the existential crisis of our generation. So the more money, the more interesting ideas, the more fantastic entrepreneurs that we can support in the space, the better.
Yeah, so not too dissimilar for what Marie is saying in terms of where the macroeconomic conditions are at and how that impacts alternative investments, VC being one of those asset class. But I think there are a couple of potential verticals that becomes a hedge towards this kind of macro conditions. One of it obviously is climate. I think the other one potentially could even be cybersecurity, but just zoning in on climate definitely is a strong hedge, given, to quote Marie, the existential threat that as a civilization we are all collectively facing. And to that end, the tailwind towards investments and interest into ESG, climate, continue to go strong. From a liquidity standpoint, so like VCs, we don't sort of sprout our own monies, right? We have LPs that comes with us, and LPs are either family offices or like institutions. And a lot of these institution types, they have certain allocation and interest into climate because of the broader tailwind that's driven by public policy and so on and so forth. And I think insofar for a lot of these players, they're sort of also early in that game of trying to understand what exactly ESG means. Does it mean impact? Does it mean climate? And so as they're forming this understanding, and I think the understanding is becoming much more concrete at this point in time, they're starting to allocate into funds that fit into their mandate. Wavemaker being one of the early ones, at least in Southeast Asia. I think we are sort of trailing behind as well, understanding that climate landscape and being one of those potential folks that a lot of these liquidity providers could see as potential partner in seeing their mandate and seeing through a lot of investment into that space. Having said that, I think it's still early days. I think there's still a huge white space in terms of impact that needs to be done in Southeast Asia, especially across bringing us closer to net zero and contributing as a civilization in this collective human endeavor. And so we definitely need more liquidity coming in, and definitely we need to see more fund managers popping out in meeting the different needs across this archipelago.
Thanks for this. Before I turn to our investees, actually, I have a follow-up question because we may have people like fundraising in the audience. What are the concrete steps, or what needs to happen between now and funding conditions to ease a little bit? Is it purely interest rate driven by, interest rate set by central banks? Are there other factors? What do we need to be on the lookout for funding condition to ease? And you mentioned liquidity. Is it LP related as well?
No, I think yes, obviously, right? I mean, as you think about allocations and you think about rates, obviously, if you are managing a fund institution as a CIO, you're thinking in terms of allocation and de-risking or going strong, right? And a lot of the trend seems to say maybe we should allocate some chunk of our liquidity into certain assets, right? Which are more towards bond-driven, interest-driven derivatives as opposed to going into equities, right? I think that's a common conversation points that we hear across and even today, right? And so to that end, there will be that level of impact in terms of liquidity that flows into alternative. But within that alternative class, I think what really shines is the climate sort of sector because of the tailwinds across public policies. You just heard the President of Singapore today talking in his final comment talking about the importance of thinking about our glaciers and mountains, and which is akin to that. And then you hear a lot about in terms of even families coming in and recognizing that there need to be certain allocation towards impact to secure a better future for the next generations, for that matter. And so therefore there is, whilst alternative class is looking a bit suspect, but I think within that climate sector it's a strong hedge, where I think continuously you'll see more interest and where you need to have more strong, solid fund managers who understand this space and becoming those players who can then invest and support many of the initiatives that's going on across the region. So does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Maybe just to add on, VCs, we're famous for herd mentality, right? And so I think in the climate space, in order for there to ease up some funding, what we would love to see in Southeast Asia is some, climate tech companies with strong unit economics that are growing well, that are, put in a couple of good rounds, and then I think everyone will start to look at this space and kind of go, oh, which climate tech companies am I not seeing? Which ones am I missing out on? So I guess, for anyone who is looking at raising or building or starting something in the climate tech space, I would say, please, please, please focus on strong unit economics, focus on solid growth, and chart the path for other companies and other founders to enter the space by building a solid class of high quality, high growth companies.
Thanks. So I'm now going to turn to the investees, right? Raymond, maybe, then Ben. So you guys are veteran in this space. You've went through multiple rounds of funding. You are experienced in terms of raising funds for ESG fintech and climate tech companies. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey? And as we were preparing this panel, you brought up a good point about the scrutiny you need to have on investors, on their LPs, on source of funds. So can you tell us, what's good capital, bad capital?
Yeah, dangerous question. Thanks for throwing it. Look, 3-4 years ago when we were raising the first time round, it was a different capital environment. Money was free. It was LPs were giving it away, and that was getting kind of passed through. There was also, fair to say, a lot of rubbish companies out there. And there remains today a lot of rubbish companies out there. And unfortunately what that does is soak up capital. And that capital doesn't get allocated to different projects. Some of those projects may have some of the characteristics Marie was talking about. You've also got capital providers out there who perhaps at the back of that herd, the herd mentality you were talking about, and what that has the effect to do is misdirect investees that are out there. And so you've got investees chasing this mythical soccer ball of funding around. You've got these, be they VCs or other pools of money, they're kind of like the parents on the sideline shouting instructions, but they don't really know what they're talking about. And then you've got a couple of people who do, kind of likened to the coaches, and everyone is clamouring for them. I spoke to a very well-respected VC general partner the other day, asked him how many companies he'd seen last year. The number was over 1,000. He'd invested in 5, and none of them came cold. Right? So you've got, for an investor, you've got this highly inefficient process where you've got to shout at the world. Every time you talk to someone, they tell you your story needs to be slightly different. And so you end up chasing this kind of bouncing ball around. So that's the environment that we're being asked to raise money in today. 3 or 4 years ago, it was different, because you had all these people with money that felt like they were missing out on all the great deals. And so you had a good growth story, you didn't need to have the fundamentals. As a result, the scrutiny that we talked about has come today, but it's come heavier than it needs to. So maybe it's a 3-day bender that we're all getting over. It's not really clear what it is, but there's definitely a greater hurdle to raise money today, as there should be. Unfortunately, there's still just as many rubbish companies out there. And you can throw up a great story if it's effectively unvalidated or unverified. Ben can tell you what an unverified emission number looks like, and he knows how to verify it. We don't have that same level of verification when it comes to startups, and I think that's probably one of the key elements still missing.
Yeah, I was going to add, we don't really have that verification when it comes to the funders either, I think is probably the challenge we've faced. So yeah, we've raised around 12 million US dollars, mostly family office and individuals. But we probably, literally when any fund comes to us and says, we'd like to invest in your company, about 2 years ago we started saying, okay, great, fill in this form and tell us about your fund, tell us about your theory of change, tell us about this category. And it's fair to say that the answers have got better, but the vast majority of them were crap. So if you want to invest in climate tech companies and you are a fund, I would say either start thinking carefully about this as a category rather than it being a sort of cool thing to be investing in. So I think get a really strong thesis around a specific component. Obviously climate tech or FinTech is pretty broad in itself. So do that first, and then make sure that when you're evaluating companies, you come with either the ideal fund is one where your LPs have put money into it on the back of a strong focus on climate. It's not to say that funds that are not just climate are not good. It's always great to be able to put climate in as part of it, but from a company's point of view as a founder, we really want to put our business and have backers from individuals who are looking to put their money into addressing this problem, not just looking to put their money into something that's going to make some money. So I think that's been part of the journey we've seen in the last couple of years. Is I think there's a maturity growing, but it is still like we're a bunch of toddlers in a playpen, if you want to use the analogy, on a field. So it's getting more mature, but I think we need, as Marie said, a few breakouts. But the problem is the world is still doing not enough, let's say politely, on this issue. So we need to accelerate 100 times, 1,000 times effort, and there will be some breakout companies for sure.
Well, thanks for this, because that's a great segue into my next question. On one side, we've talked about great unique economics, and we need to be demonstrated. On the other hand, we talked about good reasons to invest in this space. So a question to all of you, like, should ESG FinTech be subject to the same market pricing as other sectors? Is it a controversial question? I do hope it is, or maybe I hope it's not. Like, what do you think?
I can go first. From my perspective, it's a resounding yes. Look, you know, there's different types of capital, right, out there. There's philanthropic, there's grant capital, there's concessionary capital, there's there's science and funding, research and development capital. You know, when we talk about our commitment to our investors and our LPs, we are talking about VC commercial category of funding, which means that we have committed to our investors to be aiming for a 3 to 5x return on their fund and their monies. So from that perspective, you know, we should be holding climate companies to the same standards as any other VC type of investment. And I actually think it's really important that there are investors that are looking at this opportunity from a commercial perspective. First of all, because I always get excited when bankers start wading into sectors and issues, because that means that there's real money to be made. And unless there's some sort of huge overhaul of our economic structure globally, capital and making money is what's going to drive long-term sustainable change. And so I think it's actually great that we hold climate companies to the same standards. And for those companies that are not ready, or for those ideas that still need more time in the lab, then go after other types of funding that's available as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see why not, right? Because this is what we're seeing right now is potentially the third sort of revolution of climate tech, and we have heard a lot of boom and bust sort of cycle in the last 2 cycles, and a lot of those are driven by pricing issues, less fundamental driven sort of unit economics. And so therefore for this third attempt where you're starting to see a lot of interest in this space, it is super important that we get it right this time round. And the key point to this is really to talk about fundamentals, right? So we need everybody to think about core fundamentals and ensuring as an entrepreneur, you are taking money from investors knowing exactly that there is a certain return, terminal return that the investors are expecting, and so therefore drive towards that, whilst at the same time try or rather have that sort of dual sort of target in achieving those sort of impact factors that we're thinking about gearing towards decarbonization. In a way, it becomes quite challenging for sure. But if this entire asset class of climate tech is to be sustainable and is to attract more liquidity coming in and to see that the same kind of impact that it needs to see into everyday lives, then unfortunately, that is the kind of degree of expectation that a lot of fund managers, entrepreneurs need to set and sort of standard in ensuring that as an asset class, all of us become successful.
So are you pricing impact then?
I mean, yeah, well, I wouldn't say I'm pressing impact, but what I'm saying here is really about ensuring that the companies who get invested are able to return the premium to the investors, right?
So
and
you're holding
in doing
them to a
so,
higher burden.
and in doing so, will attract more liquidity and investments into this space.
Yeah, but you're holding them to a higher burden, not the same burden, because you're not asking.
It's not just you; it's also the fund managers. So the fund managers are also now, accountable to their investors to make sure that we report back to our investors the same kind of impact, and working hard with the founders to make sure that they are also becoming sustainable. So it's not just you in this case, but it's us coming in together and making sure that we are returning that sort of investment back to our investors. But so yes, as a whole, it is difficult.
I'm not saying it's not difficult, but what I'm saying is you're not providing a level playing field there, because you're saying you've got to have the same returns and you don't get to ignore impact, whereas the people we're competing against for capital get to ignore impact. So if you're truly going to say it's a level playing field, until you properly price, and it's not just climate impact, we always hijack ESG with climate, but until you're properly pricing ESG impact and putting a financial number on some of those non-financial metrics, all you're doing is creating a higher hurdle for ESG compliant companies. We're talking about FinTech here, right? So it's not, there is a whole world that sits behind ESG impact that's ESG FinTech that's impact projects or ESG projects. But if you are at an ecosystem level going to hold them to a higher burden, we're always going to be stuck in this cycle of not good enough, not high enough, not fast enough, all of those kind of things. Because you're asking us to help manage the transition to a fully priced world, but you're pricing us and not pricing the other projects. So I would say they absolutely should be held to the same fundamentals, but that is not that the ESG FinTech projects need to. It's just you need to start pricing non-compliance?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, so my background is an environmental economist. I've worked for years in the Treasury Department in New Zealand, but also thinking about how we measure progress in society beyond a GDP metric model. This is fundamentally the problem we have, if I'm honest, around the way that we think about value in society. So as funds are valuing economic return, which is fair, that's what funds do. But what they're not valuing is environmental or social impact. They're not valuing that, and therefore, I don't mind being held onto the same, performance metrics on financials. I think it's fine, but we need to price and value the environmental and social impact that companies are having, because that will then drive more capital into this market. Because we're all individuals, our LPs that put in money, they want to see a return, but they want to see a return. If they can be shown there's also an impact alongside it, I think you will find we'll compete.
And I think a lot of this is really a function of how this entire space is going to evolve. But if you're asking me at this snapshot in time, in terms of how fund managers are communicating with their LPs, it is not towards what both of you guys are trying to aspire towards, which I think is where the industry needs to be, right? But this is where collectively, eventually, there needs to be some level of education that needs to be done on every other players within the ecosystem. But there are certain players within the ecosystem which it's going to take some time for them to reach that level of understanding. And a lot of that could potentially even be driven by policies, in terms of potentially even tax credits and all that sort of stuff. But at this snapshot in time, if you're asking me, how do we then communicate with our investors, those are the kind of metrics that they're looking for. But is this it? Is this the final product? No, and so we continuously have to educate the ecosystem.
So one of the things that I've been a little bit on my soapbox about for the last kind of 12 months, talking to actually fellow VCs, is I'd like to, there's many generalist VC funds that are wading into climate and sustainability, which I think overall is great. But it's actually very difficult to quantify impact. And so in some ways we're lucky because our North Star metric is carbon dioxide equivalent, and it's actually relatively easy to measure and to count. But it's much, much harder to count impact on livelihoods, financial inclusion for women, even water is, impact on water is actually really difficult to quantify. And so what I would like to see the VC and the investor community do is to be able to track impact much better. And so if there's two companies that are side by side that have similar unit economics, you want to be investing in the one that has the biggest impact. And so how do you quantify that, and how are you able to measure it? It's actually, we built 100 by 100 companies. We looked around. Do you know how much CO2e on a net basis Tesla, one of the biggest EV companies in the world, is abated? So it's something like 8 to 10 megatons. It's actually very small in the grand scheme of things. And so that, I think that's the challenge that we have to hold, I think, the VC community, but then also our startups too, is how do you actually measure the impact that you're having?
I can just pick up on one point, because you've called out a very convenient truth, which is we only measure CO2, therefore how can we think about those other things? But in a world where we can measure those other things, be it policy-driven, be it by proper investment into ESG FinTech, into actually getting to measurement, you sit there as a fund manager, you've got two projects in front of you. One of them has subpar economics that is bridged by impact, or maybe even steps over. Are you going to invest in that because you value impact now that we've got measurement?
No, because that's not my class of capital. There's another class of capital that should make that investment.
Right.
So it's a screening criteria.
Thanks for the debate up here. I'm going to try to progress in the conversation. I don't know that I can...
We're actually good friends, so
yeah, I don't think I can reconcile everyone here, but let me try to see if we can close the gap or narrow the gap a little bit. There's been a lot of talk this year about blended finance, where public financing comes to complement private financing to improve returns and make projects that wouldn't otherwise be possible. These generally apply to large sustainable infrastructure projects, so it's more, for asset managers and the likes. But is there any chance that this can apply to fintech funding, ESG fintech funding? And have you seen any good examples of similar initiative? Could be grants by governments, could be any sort of initiative where public money comes to complement private money to make this transformation possible.
Yeah, we have some funds from the New Zealand government, so we have in some ways ourselves benefited from it. So that's good to say. I suppose it comes back to my question, and Marie, you were saying, is like, it's not our sort of mandate, or at least we haven't got that mandate from our investors. I'd challenge like a future fund that gets set up whereby the mandate is for a carbon reduction and that they are willing. I hate the word concession and I hate all this because I think in some ways it doesn't really frame it properly, but it would be great if actual individuals, LPs, you say, it's not just the role of government to solve this stuff. Like I've been in government for many years and we cannot rely on government to solve this on its own. But we have to basically empower capital markets to come in and play their role. And I think one of the ways we can do that is to say whether you're a family office or something putting money or LP into a fund, that you want to see a strong sort of return for that in carbon abatement. And I think that's one of the things that, I don't know, I just don't want it to be like up to government to solve this stuff. And that comes from a funding perspective too.
I'd say that blended finance that takes public money only works if it's coupled with public policy. So if all the public purse is going to do is provide funds, there's lots of funds out there that can be more helpful. The way public money can be helpful is coupling it with policy and directing money towards policy areas where they're willing to make the other policy changes around it. If we talk about disclosure, that public policy area is regulating or compulsory disclosure. Those two things come together will accelerate measurement and visibility. But if all the public purse does is couple private money, it's just suggesting there's not enough private money out there, or that the private money is not smart enough. And it's difficult for the public purse to fill the gap of the private sector. So only when it's with policy is what I'd say.
Got it. I'd like to shift gear a little bit away from fundraising and turning into other stakeholders in the ecosystem, notably your clients. And I think this question will be more for Ben and Raymond. Targeting financial institutions, large commercial banks, asset managers, other types of financial institutions. What is your experience working with them like? What are their pain points? And what advice would you have for earlier stages companies when approaching large financial institutions?
Be prepared to take a long time to get things done. I mean, we have 20 tier one banks as customers, and they've all taken between 6 to 24 months to actually get to a sort of sale, I suppose. And so be patient, I suppose, is the first thing. I guess on the flip positive side, we end up on these calls with, I don't know, NatWest or DBS or these big banks, HSBC, where you're on the call and there are like almost 40 people on the screen because they are more interested in this idea than they've been in any idea they've worked on in the bank in their entire life. So the first thing to say is that there's a massive desire from the people who work in these banks to do something good. So I suppose it takes a long time, but you'll end up working with a real, amazing bunch of committed people inside these banks.
I'd agree on the time. The decision process just gets longer and longer and longer. There's the old adage, no one got fired buying IBM, and I think lots of people may get fired buying ESG tech. And I use that as a proxy for early stage companies. Because when you're in a bank, they get to a point where it's a great idea and it goes up and up and up, and then someone in procurement says, is this company going to be here in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? And that becomes a really difficult proof point. It's a reason why banks aren't necessarily the hotbed of innovation and incubation. So they've got a place in the client lifecycle, and if you can land one, fantastic, because it probably means you'll get 2, 3, even 4, particularly in Singapore. But it can also, if you don't address that initial hurdle early on, it can be problematic. The other thing you have with banks, of course, is the security overlay if you're a technology. And being a bank grade is difficult. So, Ben's obviously gone further along, which is fantastic. But I think that there are other areas where you might get more immediate returns, particularly if you're earlier in your funding cycles.
We cannot have this panel without touching on technology and products. So I'd like to ask all of you, both you guys, Ben and Raymond, but also from an investor perspective, what are the hotspots? What are the solutions you're particularly excited about in this space? And one question also on AI. Do you see AI reshaping product roadmaps, or is it just a lot of hype at the moment?
I think, well, just on your last point with regards to AI, I think yes, there's a bit of hype with regards to what's going on out there in AI. I think ultimately it's really a function of how you sort of apply some of these AI modules into your application. For example, better predictive modeling of some sort of scenarios across different sort of infrastructure. But it just becomes a sort of feature of the broader service that you're kind of offering. And so sometimes folks try to sort of push out a lot on that AI conversation, but it's really not a lot of meat there. I would say some of the areas of interest that we're looking at right now are going slightly more deeper and embedded within industries. So we're looking at things like membranes. We're looking at things that revolves around new materials within the space of construction. We're looking into new sort of fuels for industries, for aviation. Those are the kind of stuff that we get excited about, and we think there's slightly more impact as you go deeper in addressing some of the core issues and more upstream in addressing this. It also means that a lot of these investments require more capex, hence the emphasis that we need more liquidity going into this space, because that's where I think it lacks at this point in time, and the white space across Southeast Asia is significant. But that's kind of where some of these things that we are sort of looking at, while not diverging too much. But these are our pipeline of deals in our IC memos that we are sort of looking at right now. And I'm sure Marie has more stuff to talk about. So
we can abate 50% of the global carbon budget just using the technology that we have today. So there's I think there's a misconception in the climate space that it's all about, hydrogen and nuclear fusion and direct air carbon capture. And those are all really important technologies. They'll take another 10 years to come online. So I think there's a time now to ask questions like, why aren't there solar panels on every rooftop in Southeast Asia? We have all the technology that we need to reduce the energy intensity of buildings by 30%. Why isn't that being deployed? And so this is all about kind of misaligned incentives. So I think the challenge that we would put to entrepreneurs in the wider community is, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Yes, AI, if AI is necessary. But what are the core kind of business models that will create the incentives for users to adopt green technology, for people to change behavior? And I think there's a lot of kind of FinTech elements to this. So, for example, we just launched a company called Bumi Baru that's restoring degraded land in Indonesia. There's 40 million hectares of degraded land there, and per hectare you can sequester anywhere between 20 up to 60 tons of carbon in this, if you're able to convert it back into productive land. And the cost of this is $6,000 per hectare. So this is an asset class for which you can make returns, you can attract investment, And so, yes, this is a company that's restoring degraded land, but in practice, it looks much, much more like a fintech company that's looking to attract investment and deliver return to investors in the space. So I think there's so many opportunities out there that don't require science, deep tech, R&D, just a way of connecting a carbon addressable market and a dollar addressable market.
I got a question again for the audience, or 3 questions. But the first one is on products. Who in the audience has used the product called Uber? Uber. Less than I thought. What about Airbnb? Cool. So they're 2 products, right? 2 examples where it wasn't a new manufacturing process. It wasn't anything different from what existed already. It was software that made a market realize what was effectively already an existing set of resources and allocating supply and demand. So it was basically building a more efficient ecosystem. Next question, who has solar panels on their roof? Who is taking climate action? Who are using solutions to make changes in their behavior on climate? So, what we've got a problem at is there's a complete, who wants to make some change in their behavior to reduce their carbon footprint? Yep, you're in the right stage, most of you. Anyway, the problem here is we haven't got products that connect you as an individual to solutions that make it easy to put solar on the roof, to put a new HVAC system in, to basically take action. And I think that's the challenge, as Marie says, is that we've got all the technologies and products here. It's all about building a more efficient market to connect those supply with demand like you.
Raymond?
Yeah, what they said.
Okay. Okay. I think we are nearing the end of this panel, but if we end there, it will just remain talk, right? And what we are calling for is action. So if there is one thing that I can ask, each one of you as a call to action, either for Ben and Raymond to investors, or from investors to companies, or to the audience, what could be a good last word to end with, so that we can really achieve the goal, which is accelerating that transition?
I would say if you're already aware, start measuring. Because you're never going to get to impact unless you measure. And if you're an investor, invest in measurement technologies, because that will open up the impact opportunities. Otherwise, you get stuck going from marketing, which is awareness, to impact, and you don't really know where to put your money. So you put it everywhere, so you put it nowhere. So that would be my call to action.
I think, number one, coming from a VC perspective, VC investment is a function of, like when you're sort of driving and you have something on the dashboard and you have something in the horizon. VC investment is really investing in terms of what's sort of in the horizon. So, for entrepreneurs in the audience, think about, what are some of the challenges that's sort of ahead, and think about, what sort of solution that you think are viable in addressing these challenges, and recognizing that unfortunately we are living in a time where people are looking at strong fundamentals and profitability. So those are the kind of 2 sort of balls that one need to kind of juggle.
I think there's so many, but maybe the one that I'll say is, if you work in a VC fund, if you work in a bank, if you work in another kind of large institution, I think you could play a really active role in advocating for the adoption of climate solutions. As Ben mentioned, we're really cool people, and we're doing some interesting stuff. And I think we always underestimate the role that champions within large organizations and enterprises can make in turning a big ship. It only takes 1 or 2 degrees, and a big ship can completely turn and change its course. So I think there's lots of work to be done, and we want every smart person working on climate.
Yep, agree. I mean, you've seen the thing up here, right? Tons of carbon left. That thing slightly affronting. I think measurement, I would agree, is the key. And as a fund, obviously, measuring the investments you make, sure, that's important. And as a business, measuring the impact of your own business is great. But I think as individuals, I'd say it has to start. You all know how much money you earn every month. You all know how much money you spend every month. But it's a little bit shocking to me that you aren't measuring your carbon footprint yourself, and that you're thinking, because the markets are not going to move until demand moves. And if you start measuring, you will start shifting your behavior. We've done it as a family for years. It's shifted the way we spend money. That is what markets respond to. And if we can start there, things will start moving. So measure your footprint, come back next year and put more hands up.
Well, with this very concrete advice, please help me thank our very distinguished panelists for sharing their thoughts with us today. And I believe this is the opening of the ESG zone. There is a number of activities and events over the next 3 days. So please enjoy and take the advantage of it, because we are really in a very privileged place and time to take action and cause change. Thanks.